Sarah stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, adjusting the strap of her emerald green dress for the third time. The silk fabric felt foreign against her skin after months of wearing nothing but work clothes and pajamas. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to dress up, to feel beautiful, to be someone other than the dedicated marketing assistant who lived and breathed quarterly reports. "Sarah, you ready? The car is here." Maya's voice echoed through the apartment, filled with the kind of excitement that only came with being 3 weeks away from your wedding day. "Coming," Sarah called back, grabbing her clutch and taking one last look in the mirror. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and the makeup artist Maya had insisted on hiring had done wonders with her brown eyes. For once, she actually felt confident about her appearance. The living room buzzed with activity as 8 women gathered their purses and checked their phones one final time. Maya stood in the center, radiant in a white bodycon dress with "bride" spelled out in gold sequins across the chest. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled, and her smile could have powered the entire city. "Ladies, tonight is going to be legendary," Maya announced, raising a glass of champagne that someone had already pressed into her hand. "I can't believe I'm actually getting married in 3 weeks. This feels surreal." The other bridesmaids cheered, and Sarah found herself smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks. She had been dreading this night, if she was being honest. Bachelorette parties weren't really her thing. She preferred quiet dinners with close friends to loud bars full of strangers. But Maya was her oldest friend, and if Maya wanted a wild night out in the city, then Sarah would do her best to be the supportive friend she needed. The group piled into 2 Ubers, with Sarah finding herself squeezed between Jessica, Maya's college roommate, and Amanda, her cousin from Chicago. The conversation flowed around her as they discussed the night's itinerary. Dinner at an upscale Italian restaurant, followed by cocktails at 3 different rooftop bars, and ending at some exclusive club that Maya's future sister-in-law had gotten them into. "Sarah, you're being awfully quiet," Jessica observed, nudging her with her elbow. "Everything okay?" "Just taking it all in," Sarah replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The truth was, she had been feeling increasingly isolated lately. At 28, she watched as her friends paired off one by one, moving to the suburbs, starting families, building lives that seemed so far removed from her own single existence in her cramped studio apartment. The restaurant was everything Maya had promised, dimly lit with soft jazz playing in the background, white tablecloths, and servers who knew exactly how to make a group of women feel special. They were seated at a large round table in a semi-private alcove, where they could laugh loudly without disturbing other diners. The wine flowed freely, and, gradually, Sarah felt herself relaxing. She found herself laughing at Jessica's stories about her disastrous dating life and contributing her own tales from the corporate world. Maya glowed with happiness, and seeing her best friend so radiant made Sarah's earlier melancholy fade into the background. "Remember when we were in college and you swore you'd never get married?" Sarah teased Maya as they shared a dessert of tiramisu. Maya laughed, her cheeks flushed from wine and happiness. "I also swore I'd never live in the suburbs or drive a minivan. Look how well that's going." She gestured to herself ironically. "Next month I'll be Mrs. David Thompson, living in a 4-bedroom house in Westchester with a golden retriever named Murphy." "Don't forget the picket fence," Amanda added with a grin. "There literally is a picket fence," Maya admitted, causing the entire table to erupt in laughter. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself studying her friends' faces, memorizing this moment. There was something bittersweet about it, the end of an era. After Maya's wedding, everything would change. Their group dynamic would shift, and Maya would inevitably drift toward her new life as a married woman. It was natural, expected, but it still made Sarah's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. By 10:30, they were ready for the second phase of the evening. The first rooftop bar was a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The music was loud enough to feel energetic but not so loud that conversation became impossible. Maya immediately gravitated toward the dance floor, pulling Jessica and Amanda with her. Sarah hung back at their table, content to watch her friends dance and sip her Manhattan. She had never been much of a dancer, preferring to observe rather than participate. The alcohol had relaxed her enough that she felt pleasantly buzzed without being drunk, a careful balance she had mastered over the years. Not much of a dancer. Sarah turned to find a woman about her age standing nearby, holding a glass of white wine. She had short auburn hair and kind eyes behind stylish glasses. Not particularly, Sarah admitted. I'm more of a wallflower by nature. I'm here for moral support. Bachelorette party, the woman guessed, nodding toward Maya, who was currently attempting some sort of choreographed routine she had obviously seen on social media. Guilty, Sarah replied. I'm Sarah, by the way. Claire. And, don't worry, I understand completely. I'm here with my work team for someone's promotion celebration, and I'm definitely the designated wallflower of the group. They fell into easy conversation, bonding over their shared preference for observation over participation. Claire worked as a graphic designer for a small agency downtown, and she had the kind of dry sense of humor that Sarah appreciated. For the first time all evening, Sarah felt like she could be completely herself. Their conversation was interrupted when Maya appeared at the table, slightly out of breath from dancing and glowing with perspiration. Sarah. You have to come dance with us. This is supposed to be a celebration. I'm perfectly happy here, Sarah protested, but Maya was already pulling her toward the dance floor. Nice meeting you. Sarah called to Claire over her shoulder, genuinely disappointed to end their conversation. The music pulsed around them as Maya spun Sarah into the center of their group. Despite her protests, Sarah found herself moving to the beat, laughing as her friends created an impromptu dance circle around the bride. The alcohol and the infectious energy of her friends gradually wore down her inhibitions, and she allowed herself to get lost in the moment. They stayed at the first bar for over an hour before Maya declared it was time to move on. The second rooftop bar had a completely different vibe, more upscale, with craft cocktails that cost twice as much and a crowd that looked like they had stepped out of a fashion magazine. Sarah felt slightly underdressed despite her careful preparation earlier. The group found a high-top table near the edge of the rooftop, where they could look out over the city lights while they sipped their overpriced drinks. The conversation had taken on the slightly slurred quality that came with several hours of drinking, and the topics had shifted from work and relationships to more intimate confessions. I have to admit something, Maya said, leaning in conspiratorially. I'm terrified about the wedding. What do you mean? Jessica asked, her brow furrowing with concern. Not about marrying David, Maya clarified quickly. I love him completely. I'm just terrified about the actual wedding. What if something goes wrong? What if I trip walking down the aisle? What if the flowers are wrong? What if people don't have fun? The group immediately rallied around her, offering reassurances and sharing their own wedding horror stories that had ended up being funny in retrospect. Sarah listened to her friends comfort Maya and felt a familiar pang of loneliness. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt part of something bigger than herself, the way Maya clearly felt surrounded by all these people who loved her. The third bar was smaller and more intimate, with exposed brick walls and Edison bulb lighting that created a warm, cozy atmosphere. By this point, the group was definitely feeling the effects of their bar crawl, and their laughter had become louder and more uninhibited. Sarah had switched to water an hour ago, knowing that someone needed to maintain some level of responsibility for the group. She found herself playing the role of mother hen, making sure everyone had eaten enough, monitoring alcohol consumption, and keeping track of purses and phones. It wasn't a role she had consciously chosen, but it was one she seemed to fall into naturally in group situations. The responsible one, the designated driver, the voice of reason, all roles that kept her slightly separate from the fun everyone else was having. As the night wore on, Sarah noticed that Maya was getting increasingly sentimental. She kept pulling individual friends aside for tearful conversations about how much their friendship meant to her and how scared she was about everything changing after the wedding. When it was Sarah's turn for this conversation, they found themselves in a quiet corner of the bar, away from the rest of the group. I need you to promise me something, Maya said, gripping Sarah's hands tightly. I need you to promise that we'll always be friends, even after I'm married. I know things will change, but I can't lose you. You've been my constant through everything. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at her oldest friend. They had met freshman year of college when they were randomly assigned as roommates, and, despite being complete opposites, they had formed an instant bond. Maya was outgoing and adventurous, while Sarah was cautious and analytical. Maya dove headfirst into every new experience, while Sarah preferred to observe and plan. But, somehow, their differences had complemented each other perfectly. Of course we'll always be friends, Sarah said, squeezing Maya's hands. Marriage doesn't change 15 years of friendship. You're stuck with me whether you like it or not. Maya laughed through her tears and pulled Sarah into a tight hug. I don't know what I'd do without you. You've always been my anchor. The moment was interrupted by Jessica, who appeared beside them with a concerned expression. Ladies, we have a problem. Amanda is in the bathroom crying about her ex-boyfriend, and I think we might need to consider calling it a night soon. Sarah looked around the bar and realized that their group had definitely reached the point where the evening should probably wind down. Several of the women were showing signs of having had too much to drink, and the emotional intensity that came with alcohol was starting to surface in ways that weren't entirely positive. Maybe we should skip the club, Sarah suggested gently. We could go back to your apartment and continue the party there. Maya considered this for a moment, then nodded. You're probably right. I'd rather end on a high note than push it and have someone get sick or emotional. They spent the next 30 minutes gathering the group and coordinating rides back to Maya's apartment. Sarah found herself in logistics mode, making sure everyone had their belongings and arranging for Ubers to accommodate the entire group. It was nearly midnight by the time they made it back to Maya's building. Maya's apartment was spacious and beautifully decorated, reflecting her career in interior design. The living room was done in soft neutrals with pops of color from throw pillows and artwork, and it felt like the perfect space for continuing their celebration in a more intimate setting. Someone found Maya's Bluetooth speaker and connected their phone, filling the apartment with a playlist of songs from their college years. The atmosphere immediately became more relaxed and comfortable. Several of the women kicked off their heels and curled up on the couches, while others gravitated toward the kitchen to raid Maya's refrigerator for snacks. Sarah found herself in the kitchen, automatically taking on the role of hostess and making sure everyone had water and something to eat. You don't have to take care of everyone, you know, Maya said, appearing beside her as Sarah arranged crackers and cheese on a plate. I don't mind, Sarah replied automatically, then paused to consider whether that was actually true. Did she mind? She wasn't sure anymore. Taking care of others had become such a natural instinct that she rarely stopped to think about whether it was something she enjoyed or simply something she felt obligated to do. As the night wound down, the group gradually became more contemplative. They found themselves sharing memories from college, talking about their dreams and fears, and reflecting on how much their lives had changed since they first met. Sarah listened to her friends talk about their relationships, their careers, their hopes for the future, and realized how little she had contributed to these conversations. It wasn't that she didn't have thoughts or feelings about these topics. It was more that she had become so used to being the listener, the supporter, the one who helped others process their emotions, that she had forgotten how to share her own. When was the last time she had talked to someone about her own dreams and fears? When was the last time she had even taken the time to figure out what those dreams and fears were? By 2 in the morning, most of the group had either fallen asleep on Maya's couches or called rides home. Sarah found herself helping Maya clean up the remnants of their party, loading the dishwasher and wiping down counters while Maya changed into pajamas. Thank you for tonight, Maya said as they finished tidying up. I know this isn't really your scene, but it meant everything to me that you were here. The following Saturday arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made the city feel alive with possibility. Sarah had spent the week thinking about her revelations from Maya's bachelorette party, and she had made a decision. Instead of spending another weekend alone in her apartment, catching up on work and binge-watching Netflix, she was going to accept Jessica's invitation to a gallery opening downtown. Standing in front of her closet, Sarah deliberated over what to wear to an art gallery opening. She had no idea what the dress code would be for such an event, having never attended one before. After trying on and discarding several outfits, she settled on a simple black dress with a leather jacket, sophisticated enough for an art event but not so formal that she would stand out if everyone else was dressed casually. The gallery was located in the trendy arts district, housed in a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and polished concrete floors. Sarah arrived fashionably late, having spent 20 minutes walking around the block to calm her nerves. She wasn't sure why she felt so anxious. It wasn't as if she was attending alone. Jessica would be there, along with several other people she knew from college. The space buzzed with conversation and the gentle clink of wine glasses. The featured artist had created a series of abstract paintings that played with light and shadow, and Sarah found herself genuinely intrigued by the work. She had always appreciated art but rarely took the time to seek it out, another casualty of her routine-driven lifestyle. "Sarah, you made it." Jessica appeared at her side, looking effortlessly chic in a flowing midi skirt and vintage band t-shirt. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." "Honestly, neither was I," Sarah admitted, accepting a glass of white wine from a passing server. "But I decided it was time to try new things." Jessica raised an eyebrow at this uncharacteristic statement but didn't comment. Instead, she linked arms with Sarah and led her toward a group of people clustered around one of the larger paintings. "Come on, I want you to meet some people." The next hour passed pleasantly as Jessica introduced Sarah to various friends and acquaintances. There was Marcus, a journalist who wrote for an alternative weekly and had strong opinions about the commodification of art. There was Elena, a photographer who was documenting the changing face of the city's neighborhoods. There was David, not Myers David, but a different David who taught high school English and spent his summers traveling to obscure literary festivals. Sarah found herself engaging in conversations that stretched her mind in ways her daily routine never did. Marcus challenged her assumptions about the role of art in society, while Elena showed her photographs on her phone that revealed beauty in the most unexpected urban corners. David recommended books she had never heard of and made her want to rediscover her love of reading, which had somehow gotten buried under years of quarterly reports and project deadlines. For the first time in months, Sarah felt intellectually stimulated. She realized how much she had missed engaging with ideas that had nothing to do with marketing strategies or client presentations. In college, she had been a literature major with dreams of becoming a writer. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had been filed away under impractical and replaced with the more sensible goal of steady employment. As the evening progressed, the gallery began to empty out, but the core group that had formed around Jessica showed no signs of leaving. Someone suggested moving the party to a wine bar around the corner, and before Sarah knew it, she was walking down the street with a group of near strangers, feeling more alive than she had in years. The wine bar was small and intimate, with mismatched furniture and walls lined with books. It felt like someone's living room, if that someone happened to have excellent taste in wine and an extensive knowledge of obscure jazz records. Sarah found herself seated at a corner table with Elena and David, deep in a conversation about travel and the ways different places shaped your perspective on life. "I spent 3 months in Prague a few years ago," Elena was saying, "and it completely changed how I see architecture. There's something about those Baroque buildings that makes you understand how art and daily life can coexist in ways we've forgotten here." "I had a similar experience in a tiny village in Ireland," David added. "I went there to research a poet who had lived there in the 1920s, and ended up staying an extra 2 weeks just because the pace of life was so different. Everyone had time for conversation, for storytelling. It made me realize how rarely we actually connect with each other here." Sarah found herself sharing her own brief travel experiences, mostly work trips that had left little time for exploration but had still managed to show her glimpses of different ways of living. She talked about a conference in Portland where she had accidentally discovered a used bookstore that stayed open until midnight and was filled with people reading and discussing books as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She described a business dinner in New Orleans where the conversation had lasted until 3 in the morning, ranging from jazz history to philosophy to the best way to make gumbo. You should travel more, Elena said, studying Sarah with the same intensity she probably brought to her photography. I can tell you're someone who would really blossom in different environments. The comment stuck with Sarah as the evening continued. Was she someone who would blossom in different environments? She had never really thought of herself that way. In her mind, she was the stable one, the predictable one, the one who stayed in familiar territory while others went off on adventures. But, listening to Elena and David talk about their experiences, she felt a stirring of something that might have been wanderlust. By the time they left the wine bar, it was nearly midnight, and Sarah realized she had been out later 2 weekends in a row than she had been in the previous 6 months combined. More importantly, she had enjoyed herself. She had engaged with new ideas, met interesting people, and felt like the person she might have been if she had made different choices along the way. Walking home through the quiet streets, Sarah pulled out her phone and did something completely out of character. She opened her banking app and checked her savings account balance. She had been diligently saving money for years, telling herself it was for emergencies or maybe eventually a down payment on a condo. But, looking at the number on her screen, she realized she had enough saved to take a real vacation, not a long weekend visiting family or a work trip with sightseeing squeezed in around meetings, but an actual adventure. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Over coffee and the Sunday crossword puzzle, she found herself browsing travel websites instead of catching up on work emails. She looked at photos of Tuscany, where she could take cooking classes and explore medieval hill towns. She read about a writer's retreat in Scotland that welcomed amateurs alongside published authors. She even looked at volunteer opportunities in Costa Rica, where she could help with sea turtle conservation while learning Spanish. None of these options were particularly practical or sensible, which was exactly why they appealed to her. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah was considering doing something purely because it called to her, not because it made financial sense or advanced her career goals. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. How was the gallery opening? I can't believe you actually went to something artsy. Sarah smiled as she typed back, it was great. I'm thinking about taking a real vacation. Maybe even traveling alone. Her phone rang immediately. Did someone hack your phone? Maya's voice was full of amused disbelief. Sarah Coleman does not take spontaneous vacations, and she definitely doesn't travel alone. Maybe it's time for Sarah Coleman to try some new things, Sarah replied, surprised by her own conviction. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Okay, what happened at that gallery? Did you meet someone? Are you having some kind of quarter-life crisis? No, wait, we're past quarter life. Is this a third-life crisis? Sarah laughed. I think I'm just realizing that I've been living my life on autopilot for the past few years. Going out last night reminded me that there are other ways to spend time besides working and watching TV. I'm proud of you, Maya said, and Sarah could hear the sincerity in her voice. I've been worried about you lately. You seemed so sad at my bachelorette party, even when you were smiling. The observation caught Sarah off guard. She had thought she had hidden her melancholy better than that. I wasn't sad, she protested, then reconsidered. Okay, maybe I was a little sad. But it wasn't about you or the wedding. It was about me and the fact that I couldn't remember the last time I felt excited about anything. And now you're excited about traveling alone to foreign countries. Maybe, Sarah admitted. I know it sounds crazy, but last night I met these people who were so passionate about their work and their interests, and it made me realize I can't remember the last time I felt passionate about anything. I used to want to be a writer, remember? I used to read 3 books a week and write terrible poetry in coffee shops. Your poetry wasn't terrible, Maya said loyally. It was just very earnest. Sarah laughed. That's a diplomatic way of saying terrible. But the point is, I used to have interests and dreams outside of my job. Somewhere along the way, I let those parts of myself disappear. They talked for another 30 minutes, with Maya offering enthusiastic support for Sarah's newfound desire for adventure. By the time they hung up, Sarah felt even more committed to the idea of taking a real vacation. She spent the rest of the day researching destinations and possibilities, feeling an excitement building that she hadn't experienced in years. Monday morning brought a return to routine, but Sarah carried her weekend revelations with her into the office. She found herself looking at her co-workers differently, wondering if any of them felt the same sense of being trapped in routines that no longer served them. During her lunch break, instead of eating at her desk while scrolling through social media, she walked to a nearby bookstore and bought 3 novels that David had recommended. The week passed quickly, filled with the usual meetings and deadlines, but Sarah felt different. She was more present, more engaged, even with tasks that had previously felt monotonous. The possibility of change, even if she hadn't acted on it yet, had shifted something fundamental in her perspective. Thursday evening, she met Jessica for dinner at a small bistro in her neighborhood. Jessica had been intrigued by Sarah's account of her weekend transformation and wanted to hear more details. "So you're really going to book a trip?" Jessica asked over their shared appetizer of burrata and roasted vegetables. "I think so," Sarah replied. "I've been researching this writing retreat in Scotland. It's 3 weeks long, and you spend the mornings in workshops and the afternoons exploring the countryside. It's exactly the kind of thing I would have talked myself out of a month ago." "What changed?" Sarah considered the question while she sipped her wine. "I think I realized that I've been waiting for my life to begin instead of actually living it. I kept thinking that someday I'd be ready for adventures, when I was more settled or had more money or had figured everything out. But I'm 28, I have a good job, I have savings, and I'm probably never going to feel completely ready for anything. So why not just start?" Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's really brave. Most people never get to that realization, or if they do, they don't act on it. Ask me again after I've actually booked the ticket," Sarah laughed. "Right now it's still just an idea." But even as she said it, she knew she was going to follow through. The writing retreat in Scotland had captured her imagination in a way that surprised her. She could picture herself sitting in a cottage overlooking rolling hills, working on the novel she had always talked about writing but never started. She could imagine evening walks through villages that had existed for centuries, conversations with fellow writers from around the world, and the luxury of having nothing to do but focus on creativity. After dinner, Sarah walked home with a sense of anticipation that made her feel younger than she had in years. She thought about the gallery opening, about Elena and David and their passionate engagement with the world around them. She thought about Maya's upcoming wedding and the way love had transformed her friend's entire existence. She thought about her own life and the possibilities that lay ahead if she was brave enough to reach for them. That night, she opened her laptop and began drafting an email to her boss about taking extended vacation time. She researched the writing retreat more thoroughly, reading testimonials from past participants and studying the curriculum. She looked at flights to Edinburgh and calculated the total cost of the trip, including accommodation and meals. By midnight, she had filled out the application for the retreat and was staring at the submit button. Her finger hovered over the mouse, and she felt her heart racing with a combination of excitement and terror. This was it, the moment where she either chose adventure or chose safety. She thought about Elena's words, "You're someone who would really blossom in different environments." She thought about David's stories of unexpected discoveries in foreign places. She thought about the version of herself who used to write poetry in coffee shops and dream of traveling the world. Sarah clicked submit. The confirmation email arrived within minutes, and she stared at her laptop screen with a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. She had actually done it. She had applied for a 3-week writing retreat in Scotland, and, if accepted, she would be spending August in a completely different country, pursuing a dream she had nearly forgotten she had. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi Sarah, this is Claire from the gallery opening last weekend. Jessica gave me your number. I hope that's okay. I was wondering if you'd like to get coffee sometime and continue our conversation about travel and books." Sarah stared at the message, surprised by how pleased she felt to hear from Claire. She had enjoyed their brief conversation at the rooftop bar, but in the excitement of the rest of the evening, she hadn't thought to ask for her contact information. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah submitted her application to the Scottish writing retreat, and she was beginning to think she had been overly optimistic about her chances of acceptance. Every day she checked her email with a mixture of hope and dread, wondering if today would bring either good news or crushing disappointment. She had thrown herself into research about Scotland, learning about the history of the Highlands, reading contemporary Scottish authors, and even downloading a language app to familiarise herself with Scottish Gaelic phrases she would probably never use. Her friendship with Claire had blossomed into something Sarah treasured. They met for coffee twice a week, alternating between different neighbourhoods to explore parts of the city neither had spent much time in. Claire had a way of seeing beauty in unexpected places. She would point out interesting architectural details Sarah had walked past 1,000 times without noticing, or suggest they try a tiny Ethiopian restaurant tucked between a laundromat and a cell phone repair shop. On a particularly grey Thursday in late March, Sarah was sitting at her desk, trying to focus on a presentation about Q2 marketing strategies, when her phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was listed as Highland Writers Retreat, and Sarah's heart jumped into her throat. She stared at the notification for a full minute before opening it, suddenly, terrified that 3 weeks of anticipation would end in rejection. "Dear Ms. Coleman," the email began, "we are delighted to inform you that your application for the Highland Writers Retreat has been accepted for our August session. We were particularly impressed by your writing sample and your thoughtful responses to our program questions." Sarah stopped reading and let out a small shriek that caused her cubicle neighbor to look over with concern. She was going to Scotland. She was actually, really going to spend 3 weeks in the Scottish Highlands working on her writing. The dream she had harbored for exactly 23 days was going to become reality. She immediately texted Claire, "I got in. Scotland, here I come." The response came back almost instantly, "Congratulations. We absolutely have to celebrate. Drinks tonight." For the rest of the day, Sarah found it impossible to concentrate on work. She kept pulling up the acceptance email to reread it, confirming that she hadn't imagined the whole thing. During her lunch break, she walked to the bookstore where she had bought David's recommendations and purchased a guidebook to Scotland and a journal specifically for the retreat. That evening, she met Claire at a wine bar in Soho that Claire had discovered during one of her photographic expeditions around the city. The space was warm and inviting, with exposed brick walls covered in local artwork and soft jazz playing in the background. Claire had already secured them a corner table and was beaming with excitement when Sarah arrived. "I am so proud of you," Claire said, raising her glass of Pinot Noir in a toast. 3 weeks ago you were telling me about how you never did anything spontaneous, and now you're going to Scotland to write a novel. It's like you've become a completely different person." "I think I'm becoming who I was supposed to be all along," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the profundity of the statement. "I've spent so many years being practical and sensible and safe that I forgot there was another version of myself underneath all that caution." They spent the evening planning Sarah's adventure in minute detail. Claire, who had backpacked through Europe in her early 20s, offered practical advice about packing and travel logistics. She helped Sarah research the area around the retreat, identifying nearby villages worth exploring and hiking trails that would offer stunning photography opportunities. "You have to promise me you'll keep a detailed journal," Claire said as they shared a dessert of chocolate lava cake. "Not just for your writing, but for yourself. This kind of experience changes you, and you'll want to remember how you felt at each stage of the journey." "I already bought a journal specifically for the trip," Sarah admitted. "It's sitting on my bedside table, and I keep opening it to look at the blank pages. There's something both terrifying and exciting about all that potential." As they parted ways outside the wine bar, Claire gave Sarah an impulsive hug. "I'm living vicariously through you," she confessed. "Your courage to completely change your life has made me start thinking about some changes I need to make in my own." Walking home through the spring evening, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had shifted in just a month. It wasn't just the Scotland trip, though that was certainly the most dramatic change. It was the way she approached each day with more curiosity and openness. She had started reading fiction again, really reading, the way she used to in college when books could transport her completely out of her own life. She had begun writing in the mornings before work, nothing ambitious, just stream of consciousness pages that helped her reconnect with her own thoughts and feelings. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Sarah threw herself into research about the retreat faculty, reading their published works and getting excited about the workshops she would attend. She researched the history of the region where the retreat was located, learning about ancient Celtic settlements and clan battles that had shaped the landscape she would soon explore. Maya's wedding was now just 2 weeks away, and Sarah found herself looking forward to the celebration with genuine enthusiasm rather than the mixture of happiness and melancholy she had felt at the bachelorette party. Her own upcoming adventure had given her a sense of purpose and excitement that made her feel more generous in her joy for her friend's happiness. The wedding took place on a perfect Saturday in early May, with ceremony in a garden overlooking the Hudson River and reception in a restored mansion that looked like something out of a fairy tale. Sarah served as a bridesmaid, wearing a dusty blue dress that complemented her skin tone beautifully and made her feel elegant and confident. During the ceremony, as she watched Maya and David exchange vows, Sarah found herself thinking about commitment and courage in all their forms. Marriage was one kind of commitment, choosing to build a life with another person despite all the unknowns that lay ahead. But there were other kinds of commitment that required equal courage, the commitment to pursuing your dreams, to changing directions when your current path no longer served you, to being authentic even when authenticity meant disappointing people's expectations of who you should be. At the reception, Sarah was seated at a table with other college friends, including Jessica, and she found herself genuinely enjoying the conversations instead of feeling like an outsider looking in. When people asked about her upcoming trip to Scotland, she talked about it with confidence and excitement, no longer feeling the need to justify or downplay her decision. "I can't believe you're actually doing this," said Rachel, another college friend who had flown in from Denver for the wedding. "I've been saying for years that I want to take a sabbatical and travel, but I never actually do anything about it. What finally made you take the leap?" Sarah considered the question as she watched couples dancing to a jazz standard that the wedding band was performing beautifully. "I think I realized that I was living my life like it was a dress rehearsal for something else," she said finally. "Like I was waiting for permission to actually start living. But nobody was going to give me that permission except myself." Later in the evening, as the reception was winding down, Maya found Sarah on the terrace outside the ballroom, looking out over the river and the twinkling lights of the city beyond. "There you are," Maya said, settling beside her on a stone bench. "I've barely seen you all night. Are you having fun?" "I'm having a wonderful time," Sarah said honestly. "Your wedding is perfect, and you look absolutely radiant." "Thank you. But I want to talk about you for a minute." Maya turned to face her fully. "I have to tell you how proud I am of you for planning this Scotland trip. When you first told me about it, I was worried you were having some kind of breakdown. But seeing you tonight, seeing how confident and excited you are, I realize this is exactly what you needed." Sarah smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for her oldest friend's support. "I was definitely having some kind of breakdown," she admitted. "But maybe it was the good kind, the kind where you break down the walls you've built around yourself and remember who you really are underneath all the should-dos and have-tos." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the river flow past and listening to the distant sound of music and laughter from the reception. Finally, Maya spoke again. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice taking on a serious tone. "David's cousin Michael is here tonight. He's the one I mentioned before, the one who just moved back from London after finishing his graduate program. I was hoping you might meet him." Sarah turned to look at Maya with amusement. "Are you trying to set me up at your own wedding?" "Maybe a little," Maya admitted sheepishly. "But not in an obvious way. He's really interesting. He studied literature at Oxford and spent 2 years working for a publishing house in Edinburgh before deciding to come back and start a literary magazine here in New York. I just thought you two might have a lot to talk about, especially with your Scotland trip coming up." "Maya, I appreciate the thought, but I'm really not looking to complicate my life with romance right now," Sarah said gently. "I'm finally figuring out who I am when I'm not trying to be what other people need me to be." I think I need to sit with that for a while. I understand, Maya said, though she looked slightly disappointed. But, would you at least say hello to him? As a friend? He's probably the only person here who can tell you about the best bookstores in Edinburgh. Sarah laughed. Fine, but only because I'm genuinely curious about the bookstores. They made their way back inside, where Maya scanned the room before spotting her target near the bar. There he is, she said, nodding toward a man in his early 30s with dark hair and a thoughtful expression, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with an elderly woman who Sarah recognized as Maya's great-aunt Eleanor. He looks like he's being held hostage by Aunt Eleanor, Sarah observed. Maybe I should go rescue him. Perfect opening, Maya agreed, giving Sarah a gentle push in that direction. Sarah approached the conversation just as Aunt Eleanor was saying, and that's why I believe that young people today don't appreciate the value of handwritten letters. Everything is so instant now, so disposable. I actually think there's something to be said for both approaches, the man was replying diplomatically. Email and text messages have their place, but there's definitely something special about receiving a letter that someone took the time to write by hand. Aunt Eleanor, Sarah interjected with a warm smile, Maya is looking for you. Something about wanting to get a photo with all the matriarchs of the family. Aunt Eleanor's face lit up at the prospect of being photographed, and she hurried off toward where Maya was waiting near the photographer, leaving Sarah alone with the man she assumed was Michael. Thank you, he said with visible relief. I've been trapped in that conversation for 20 minutes. She's lovely, but I was starting to run out of diplomatic responses to her complaints about modern technology. I'm Sarah, she said, extending her hand. Michael, he replied, shaking it. Maya's mentioned you several times. You're the one who's going to Scotland to write, right? Guilty as charged, Sarah said. And you're the one who just came back from London and has opinions about Edinburgh bookstores, if Maya is to be believed. Michael laughed, and Sarah found herself liking the sound of it. Maya's been busy playing matchmaker, hasn't she? She's been much more subtle about it on my end, but now I see what she's been doing. Should we be offended that she thinks we need her help meeting people? Sarah asked with mock indignation. Probably. But, in her defense, her track record is pretty good. David and I have been friends since college, and I watched her set up 3 different couples who are now happily married. They fell into easy conversation, moving away from the bar to find a quieter corner where they could talk without shouting over the music. Michael had studied comparative literature at Oxford, focusing on the relationship between landscape and narrative in Celtic literature, a topic that proved surprisingly relevant to Sarah's upcoming retreat. The Highlands have this incredible literary tradition, he was saying, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. There's something about that landscape that seems to call forth stories. The writer's retreat you're attending is actually located near where several famous Scottish authors lived and worked. You'll be walking the same hills that inspired some of the most beautiful poetry in the English language. Sarah found herself genuinely engaged by his knowledge and passion. Unlike the forced conversations she had endured at countless weddings and parties over the years, this felt natural and stimulating. Michael had stories about working in London's publishing world, insights about the current state of literary magazines, and recommendations for contemporary Scottish authors she should read before her trip. There's a bookstore in Edinburgh called the Elephant House, he told her as they moved onto the dance floor for a slow song that the band had dedicated to all the couples in attendance. It's where J.K. Rowling wrote the first Harry Potter book. But, more importantly for your purposes, they have an incredible selection of contemporary Scottish literature and poetry. You could spend hours there. Sarah realized, as they swayed to the music, that this was the first time in months that she had danced with someone and felt completely comfortable. Michael was easy to talk to, intellectually stimulating, and genuinely interested in her upcoming adventure without trying to talk her out of it or suggest that she was being impractical. Can I ask you something? She said as the song was ending. What made you decide to leave London and start over here? That seems like a pretty big leap. Michael considered the question seriously before answering. I realized I was building someone else's dream instead of my own, he said finally. The publishing house was prestigious, and London was exciting, but I was just implementing other people's visions. Starting a literary magazine here means I get to help shape the conversation about what literature can be in this moment. It's scarier, but it feels more authentic. The sentiment resonated so strongly with Sarah that she felt a momentary disorientation. Here was someone who had made the same kind of decision she was making, choosing authenticity over security, pursuing passion over practicality. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift away, Sarah found herself reluctant to end her conversation with Michael. They had covered everything from favorite authors to travel experiences to their shared belief that risk-taking became more necessary, not less, as you got older and more set in your ways. "I hope this doesn't sound too forward," Michael said as they stood near the coat check, "but I'd love to take you to dinner sometime. Maybe before you leave for Scotland? I know some great restaurants, and I promise not to monopolize the conversation with publishing industry gossip." Sarah felt a flutter of attraction mixed with uncertainty. She had meant what she said to Maya about not wanting to complicate her life with romance. But there was something about Michael that didn't feel complicated. He felt like someone who would understand and support her need for independence and adventure rather than trying to change or contain it. "I'd like that," she heard herself saying. "But I should warn you, I'm in a pretty transitional place right now. I'm figuring out who I am outside of all the roles I've played for other people." "That sounds like exactly the right place to be," Michael replied. "And it sounds like Scotland is going to be perfect timing for that kind of self-discovery." As Sarah rode home in a taxi, still wearing her bridesmaid dress and carrying her uncomfortable heels in her lap, she reflected on the unexpected turn the evening had taken. She had gone to Maya's wedding focused on celebrating her friend's happiness and looking forward to her own upcoming adventure. She hadn't expected to meet someone who challenged and intrigued her in equal measure. But maybe that was exactly how the best things happened, not when you were looking for them or trying to force them, but when you were open to possibility and brave enough to be authentically yourself. Michael felt like a gift that had appeared at exactly the right moment, when she was confident enough in her own direction to risk letting someone else into her story without losing herself in the process. 2 days after Maya's wedding, Sarah found herself standing in front of her bathroom mirror at 6 in the morning, applying makeup for a dinner date that was still 12 hours away. She had changed outfits 3 times the night before, finally settling on a navy blue dress that was sophisticated but not overly formal, professional but not stuffy. The truth was, she hadn't been on a real date in over a year, and she was surprised by how nervous she felt. The day at work crawled by with unusual sluggishness. Every time her phone buzzed, she worried it might be Michael cancelling, even though he had confirmed their plans just the day before via a text message that struck exactly the right tone of anticipation without being overeager. He had suggested a small Italian restaurant in the village that he described as the kind of place where the owner's mother still makes the pasta and they don't rush you through dinner. At 5:30, Sarah left the office and walked slowly toward the restaurant, taking a deliberately circuitous route through Washington Square Park to calm her nerves. The late spring evening was perfect, warm enough that she didn't need a jacket, with that golden light that made even the most ordinary city streets look cinematic. She arrived at the restaurant exactly on time to find Michael waiting outside, looking perfectly comfortable in dark jeans and a button-down shirt that brought out his eyes. He smiled when he saw her, and Sarah felt some of her nervous tension dissipate. "You look beautiful," he said, offering her his arm. "I hope you're hungry. I may have talked up this place a bit, but I think you're going to love it." The restaurant was exactly as he had described, small, family-owned, with mismatched chairs and walls covered in photographs of 3 generations of the same Italian family. The owner, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, greeted Michael by name and showed them to a corner table that felt intimate without being cramped. "You're obviously a regular," Sarah observed as they settled into their seats. "Guilty," Michael admitted. "I moved to this neighborhood when I got back from London, and this became my go-to spot for everything from solo dinners with a book to celebrations with friends. Maria makes the best ossobuco in the city, and her son Tony has an encyclopedic knowledge of Italian wines." The conversation flowed as naturally as it had at Maya's wedding, but with an added layer of intimacy that came from being alone together instead of surrounded by wedding guests. Michael told her about his literary magazine, which was still in the planning stages but had already attracted interest from several established writers and a potential investor who believed in the project's vision. The idea is to create a platform for both emerging and established voices, he explained over plates of handmade ravioli that were so perfect Sarah briefly considered asking Maria to adopt her. Too many literary magazines either focus exclusively on experimental work that alienates general readers, or they play it so safe that nothing they publish feels urgent or necessary. I want to find the space between those extremes. Sarah found herself talking more openly about her own writing ambitions than she had with anyone except Maya. She described the novel she had been thinking about for years but had never started, a story about 3 generations of women in a family, each navigating different definitions of what it meant to be independent and strong. What's kept you from starting it? Michael asked, refilling her wine glass from the bottle of Chianti they were sharing. Fear, mostly, Sarah said, surprising herself with her honesty. Fear that I'm not good enough, fear that I don't have anything important to say, fear that I'll start it and never finish it. It's easier to keep it as a perfect idea in my head than to risk turning it into imperfect reality on the page. That's the most human thing in the world, Michael said gently. But, you know what I've learned from working with writers? The difference between published authors and people who just talk about writing isn't talent, it's the willingness to write badly at first. Every great book started as a terrible first draft. They talked about books and travel, about the ways different places had shaped their perspectives on life. Michael described living in London during Brexit, watching a country struggle with its identity and place in the world. Sarah talked about her college semester abroad in Florence, how living in a city where art and beauty were woven into everyday life had made her realize how much she had settled for purely functional existence. It's funny, Sarah said as they shared a dessert of tiramisu that Maria had insisted they try. I spent so much of my 20s being practical and responsible, thinking that was what maturity looked like. But I'm starting to think that real maturity might be about being brave enough to pursue what actually matters to you, even if it's risky or unconventional. I completely agree, Michael said. I spent 2 years in London doing work that looked impressive on paper but made me feel like I was sleepwalking through my life. Coming back here and starting over felt scary, but it also felt like waking up. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself relaxing completely for the first time in months. There was something about Michael's combination of intelligence, ambition, and gentle humor that made her feel like she could be completely herself, not the polished, professional version she presented at work, or the supportive, reliable friend she was to Maya, but the whole, complex person she was still figuring out how to be. When the restaurant began to empty out around them, they reluctantly decided to continue their conversation with a walk through the village. The streets were alive with the kind of energy that only existed in certain neighborhoods on perfect spring evenings, street musicians on corners, couples holding hands outside jazz clubs, the warm glow of restaurant windows creating pools of light on the sidewalks. Can I confess something? Michael said as they paused outside a used bookstore to examine the titles displayed in the window. I was actually nervous about tonight. Maya built you up so much that I was worried I'd disappoint you. Sarah laughed. I was terrified, she admitted. I haven't been on a real date in over a year, and I keep second-guessing everything I say. I'm out of practice at being charming and witty. Well, for what it's worth, you're succeeding admirably on both counts, Michael said. And, if it makes you feel better, I don't think either of us is trying to be anything other than ourselves tonight. It's refreshing. They walked for another hour, their conversation ranging from serious topics like their career aspirations and family relationships to silly debates about the best pizza in the city and whether literary characters were real enough to have opinions about current events. Sarah found herself laughing more than she had in months, feeling lighter and more optimistic about everything. When they finally stopped in front of Sarah's building, she felt reluctant to end the evening. It had been exactly what she had known she needed, intellectually stimulating, emotionally satisfying, and completely free of the pressure or expectations that had made dating feel like a chore in the past. I had a wonderful time, she said, meaning it completely. So did I, Michael replied. And I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, but I'd love to see you again before you leave for Scotland. Maybe I could cook you dinner? I make a decent lamb taggine, and I have a first edition copy of Hugh MacDiarmid's poetry that you might enjoy. Sarah felt a flutter of attraction mixed with something that might have been possibility. I'd like that, she said. But I should probably mention again that I'm leaving in 2 months and I'll be gone for 3 weeks. I'm not sure what that means for whatever this is. I don't think either of us needs to figure that out tonight, Michael said gently. But if you're open to it, I'd like to spend some time getting to know you better, whatever that ends up looking like. As Sarah rode the elevator up to her apartment, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She was no longer the woman who spent every weekend alone, who had convinced herself that she was content with routine and predictability. She was someone who had applied for a writing retreat in Scotland, who had made new friends at gallery openings, who had just had one of the best first dates of her life with a man who understood her desire for independence and adventure. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling energized in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine. She had slept better than she had in weeks, and her first thought wasn't about her work schedule or her to-do list, but about the possibility of seeing Michael again soon. The shift in her priorities was subtle but profound. At work, she found herself approaching even routine tasks with more enthusiasm. During her lunch break, instead of eating at her desk, she walked to the nearby park and spent an hour reading one of the Scottish novels David had recommended. The story, about a woman who inherited a cottage in the Highlands and discovered family secrets that changed her understanding of her own history, felt like a preview of the adventure waiting for her. That afternoon, her phone buzzed with a text from Michael, "Thank you for a perfect evening. Would Saturday work for dinner at my place? I promise the lamb taggine is worth the risk of eating a meal prepared by someone you barely know." Sarah found herself smiling as she typed back, "Saturday sounds perfect. Should I bring anything besides an adventurous attitude?" "Just yourself," came the reply. "And maybe an appetite for both food and literary discussion. I've been thinking about your novel idea all morning." The rest of the week passed in a pleasant haze of anticipation. Sarah found herself looking forward to Saturday with the kind of excitement she remembered from childhood before special occasions. She caught herself daydreaming during meetings, imagining conversations with Michael about books and writing and the ways creativity could shape a life. Friday evening, she met Claire for their usual coffee date, this time at a new place Claire had discovered in an up-and-coming neighborhood in Brooklyn. The cafe was housed in a converted warehouse, with high ceilings, exposed beams, and an eclectic mix of vintage furniture that created intimate conversation nooks throughout the space. "You look different," Claire observed after they had settled into a corner with their drinks, lavender latte for Claire, simple black coffee for Sarah. "You're practically glowing." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "Is it that obvious?" "Let me guess, Maya's matchmaking efforts were successful." "Maybe," Sarah admitted. "I had dinner with Michael on Wednesday, and I'm seeing him again tomorrow. It's probably nothing serious, especially with Scotland coming up, but there's something about him that feels easy. Natural." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Easy and natural are not words I've ever heard you use to describe dating." "I know, right?" Sarah laughed. "Usually I spend first dates feeling like I'm auditioning for a role I'm not sure I want. With Michael, I just felt like myself. We talked for 4 hours and it felt like 40 minutes. That's how you know it's good," Claire said sagely. "When time becomes irrelevant because you're so engaged with someone." "Are you nervous about seeing him again?" "Surprisingly, no. I think I'm finally at a place where I'm not trying to be what someone else wants me to be. If Michael likes me, great. If not, I'm still going to Scotland and I'm still building this new life for myself. The outcome of one relationship doesn't determine my happiness anymore." Claire smiled. "Listen to you, being all emotionally healthy and self-actualized. I'm proud of you." They spent the rest of the evening discussing Sarah's Scotland preparations. She had been reading voraciously about the history and culture of the Highlands, and Claire had helped her create a photography wish list of landscapes and architecture she wanted to capture during her time there. The retreat itself would provide structure for her mornings, but her afternoons and weekends would be free for exploration. I keep trying to imagine what it will feel like to wake up every morning with nothing on my agenda except writing and wandering, Sarah said as they walked to the subway station. I've been scheduled and deadline-driven for so long that the idea of that much unstructured time feels both thrilling and terrifying. You're going to love it, Claire said confidently. And you're going to come back a different person. Travel always changes you, but this kind of immersive creative experience, that's transformative. Saturday arrived with unseasonably warm weather that felt like a gift from the universe. Sarah spent the morning reading in Prospect Park, enjoying the sensation of having nowhere she needed to be and nothing urgent demanding her attention. She had begun to understand that this feeling, this sense of spaciousness in her days, was something she wanted to cultivate even after she returned from Scotland. Michael's apartment was a fifth-floor walk-up in the village, and by the time Sarah reached his door, she was slightly out of breath and grateful that she had chosen comfortable shoes. The apartment itself was exactly what she had expected based on their conversations, walls lined with bookshelves, comfortable furniture that looked lived in rather than styled, and artwork that suggested thoughtful curation rather than expensive taste. "Welcome to my sanctuary," Michael said, taking her jacket and offering her a glass of wine. "Fair warning, the lamb needs another hour, so I hope you're in the mood for conversation and literary browsing." The next 2 hours passed in what felt like minutes. Michael gave her a tour of his book collection, which was organized by a system that made sense only to him but revealed fascinating connections between different authors and time periods. He showed her first editions of poets she had studied in college, contemporary novels by writers she had never heard of but immediately wanted to read, and her entire shelf dedicated to Scottish literature that he insisted she borrow from before her trip. The lamb tagine, when they finally sat down to eat it, was everything he had promised. Sarah found herself relaxing into the domestic intimacy of sharing a meal that someone had prepared specifically for her. It had been a long time since anyone had cooked for her with care and attention, and she realized how much she had missed that particular form of affection. "Can I ask you something personal?" Michael said as they lingered over dessert and the last of the wine. "After eating your cooking, I think I owe you at least one personal answer," Sarah replied. "What made you decide to completely change your life? I mean, 6 months ago you were living one way, and now you're taking writing retreats in foreign countries and going on dates with men you met at weddings. That's a pretty dramatic shift." Sarah considered the question, swirling the last bit of wine in her glass. "I think I reached a point where the gap between who I was and who I wanted to be became impossible to ignore," she said finally. "I was living this very controlled, predictable life that looked responsible and successful from the outside, but inside I felt like I was suffocating. The Bachelorette party was kind of a wake-up call. I realized I had become a supporting character in everyone else's story instead of being the protagonist of my own. And now? Now I'm terrified and excited in equal measure," she said honestly. "I have no idea what I'm doing or where any of this leads, but for the first time in years, I feel alive. I feel like myself again." Michael reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I think you're incredibly brave," he said. "Most people recognize that gap between who they are and who they want to be, but they never do anything about it. They just learn to live with the discomfort." "What about you?" Sarah asked. "Do you ever regret leaving London?" "Never," he said without hesitation. "Even when the magazine fails spectacularly and I end up broke and living in my parents' basement, I'll never regret trying to build something meaningful instead of just maintaining something that already existed." As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself reluctant to leave. There was something about Michael's apartment, with its books and warm lighting and evidence of a life being lived thoughtfully, that made her feel peaceful in a way her own space never had. She realized that she wanted to create that same sense of intentional living in her own home. When Michael walked her to the subway station, they lingered on the platform, both reluctant to end the evening. "I'd like to see you again," he said, echoing their conversation from Wednesday night. "Even though I'm leaving soon?" Sarah asked. "Especially because you're leaving soon," he replied. I'm not looking for someone to complete me or save me from myself. I'm looking for someone who's living her own adventure and might want some company along the way. You seem like exactly that kind of person. As the train carried her home through the tunnel beneath the river, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. 2 months ago, she could never have imagined sitting in a man's apartment, talking about books and dreams and the courage required to change direction in midstream. She could never have imagined feeling so comfortable being completely herself with someone she was still getting to know. 8 weeks had passed since Maya's wedding, and Sarah's departure for Scotland was now just 3 days away. Her apartment looked like a hurricane had swept through it, clothes sorted into piles of taking, storing, and donating, travel guides bookmarked with sticky notes, and her new journal sitting on the coffee table next to a stack of Scottish novels Michael had insisted she read before the retreat. The past 2 months had been a whirlwind of preparation, anticipation, and a blossoming relationship with Michael that had surprised them both with its intensity and naturalness. They had fallen into a rhythm of seeing each other twice a week, dinner at his apartment on Wednesdays, exploring different neighborhoods together on Saturdays. Each date had deepened their connection without creating the suffocating pressure Sarah had experienced in previous relationships. What surprised her most was how easily Michael had integrated into her existing life instead of consuming it. He had joined her and Claire for coffee several times, contributing to their conversations about art and travel with insights that complemented rather than overshadowed their friendship. He had even attended Maya's housewarming party as Sarah's date, charming David with his knowledge of craft beer and winning over Maya's initial skepticism about his intentions regarding her best friend. Now, as Sarah folded her favorite sweater into her suitcase for the 3rd time, she felt a mixture of excitement and melancholy that seemed to sum up this entire period of her life. She was about to embark on the adventure she had dreamed of for months, but she was also leaving behind the first relationship in years that felt like it had real potential. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Last minute Scotland panic setting in yet? I'm bringing comfort food and wine. See you at 7. Sarah smiled, grateful for his intuitive understanding of her emotional state. She had been trying to project calm confidence about her upcoming departure, but the truth was that she was experiencing moments of pure terror alternating with waves of exhilaration. 3 weeks alone in a foreign country, pursuing a dream she had kept buried for years, felt simultaneously like the most natural thing in the world and the most terrifying risk she had ever taken. Michael arrived precisely at 7, carrying bags that revealed his excellent understanding of what constituted comfort food. Thai takeout from their favorite place, a bottle of the Scottish whiskey he had been educating her about, and a small wrapped package that made her stomach flutter with curiosity. Before you ask, it's not a going-away gift, he said, setting the bags on her kitchen counter and surveying the chaos of her apartment with amusement. It's more of a practical travel item that I thought you might appreciate. Sarah opened the package to find a beautiful leather-bound notebook, smaller than her journal but substantial enough for serious writing. The cover was embossed with a Celtic knot design, and, when she opened it, she found an inscription in Michael's careful handwriting, for capturing the moments between the moments. It's perfect, she said, feeling unexpectedly emotional. But, you said it wasn't a going-away gift. It's not, he insisted, pulling containers of pad thai and green curry from the bags. It's a coming-back gift. Something to use for observations and quick thoughts that don't belong in your official retreat journal. And, maybe, if you're feeling generous, some thoughts about a guy who'll be missing you while you're discovering your artistic soul in the Scottish countryside. They ate dinner sitting on her living room floor, surrounded by the organized chaos of her packing efforts. Sarah found herself memorizing details she hadn't consciously noticed before, the way Michael's eyes crinkled when he laughed, the gesture he made with his left hand when he was making a particularly important point, the comfortable silence that could exist between them without feeling awkward or empty. Are you nervous about anything specific? Michael asked as they shared the whiskey, which tasted like smoke and honey and seemed appropriate for her last night in the city. Everything, Sarah admitted. I'm nervous about being alone in a foreign country for 3 weeks. I'm nervous that I won't be good enough for the retreat, that everyone else will be real writers and I'll be exposed as a fraud. I'm nervous that I'll have some kind of breakdown without my normal support system around me. What else? Sarah looked at him carefully, recognizing that he was asking about more than just Scotland. I'm nervous about coming back and finding out that everything here was just a pleasant interlude while I figured out what I really wanted. I'm nervous about how this changes things between us. Michael set down his glass and moved closer to her on the floor. Can I tell you what I'm nervous about? She nodded. I'm nervous that 3 weeks of creative freedom and adventure will show you possibilities I can't compete with. I'm nervous that you'll come back completely transformed and I'll be exactly the same guy you left behind. But, mostly, I'm nervous that I'm already more invested in this than I meant to be, and I don't know how to be casual about someone like you. The honesty of his confession made Sarah's chest tighten with emotion. She had been so focused on protecting herself from disappointment that she hadn't considered that Michael might be just as vulnerable as she was. For tomorrow she would start planning her final weeks in New York before Scotland. She would research restaurants she wanted to try, museums she wanted to visit, experiences she wanted to have in her own city before seeing it with the eyes of someone who was about to leave for an adventure. And she would think about Michael, and the possibility that the best relationships might be the ones that supported your independence rather than threatening it. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the right person, at exactly the right time. The future was uncertain, but instead of finding that frightening, she found it exhilarating. She was finally living her own story, and she couldn't wait to see what happened next. Tomorrow she would call him and make plans for dinner. In 2 months she would be in Scotland, pursuing a dream she had almost forgotten she had. Tonight she was simply grateful for the way life could surprise you when you stopped trying to control every variable and started trusting that good things could happen if you remained open to them. The taxi pulled up outside her building, and Sarah looked up at her apartment windows, lit by the lamps she had left on. For the first time in years, home felt like a place she was happy to return to, not because she was hiding from the world but because she was building a life worth living. I'd love to, she typed back. I actually just did something pretty spontaneous that I think you'd appreciate. How about tomorrow after work? As she got ready for bed, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in just 1 week. She had gone from being a passive observer to someone who was actively reaching for new experiences. She had rediscovered interests she thought she had lost forever and made connections with people who expanded her perspective on what was possible. Tomorrow she would tell Claire about the writing retreat, and maybe they would become friends. Next week she would find out if her application had been accepted. In August, if everything worked out, she would be in Scotland, writing in the morning and exploring ancient landscapes in the afternoon. For the first time in years, Sarah fell asleep excited about what tomorrow might bring. The future felt full of possibility instead of predictability, and she realized that this feeling, this sense of anticipation and openness to whatever came next, was what had been missing from her carefully controlled life. Change, she was learning, wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced, pursued, celebrated. And she was just getting started. I had more fun than I expected, Sarah admitted, and she realized it was true. Despite her initial reservations, she had enjoyed herself. Maybe not in the same uninhibited way that Maya had, but in her own quiet way. As she walked to her apartment in the early morning hours, Sarah reflected on the evening. The city was quiet except for the occasional taxi or late-night delivery truck, and the cool air felt refreshing after hours in crowded bars. She thought about Claire, the woman she had met at the first bar, and wondered if she might see her again sometime. She thought about Maya's fears about everything changing after her wedding, and realized that change wasn't necessarily something to be afraid of. Maybe it was time for Sarah to make some changes of her own. Maybe it was time to stop being the observer and start being an active participant in her own life. Maybe it was time to figure out what she actually wanted, rather than simply supporting everyone else in pursuing what they wanted. But those were thoughts for tomorrow. Tonight had been about celebrating her best friend's upcoming marriage, and, despite her moments of melancholy, it had been a good night. As she unlocked her apartment door and kicked off her heels, Sarah smiled to herself. Maya was right, tonight had been legendary, just in a different way than she had expected.